We form some of our most enduring childhood memories along the ocean shore, that unique place where the land and the sea meet. For a young Bill Baker, it was on York's cliff walk that he observed, imagined, and discovered the wonders of our natural world. Here he will recount his boyhood memories of my childhood on the cliff walk, as presented in July 2015 at the York Public Library for the Friends of the Cliff Walk. Many of our most enduring childhood memories are made along the ocean shore, and for all of us, it is the unique place where the land and the sea meet. Bill Baker roamed the shore as a child in Maine and has generously agreed to give us the account of his experiences that he did for the Friends of the Cliff Walk. The title of Bill's talk, The Strategic Air Command and Me, Boyhood Memories on the Cliff Walk, harks back to the era when Pease Air Force Base was a major military installation during Bill's youth. The connection to the Cliff Walk? He's going to tell us.
Good evening, and my thanks to the Friends of the Cliff Walk for inviting me to share with you some memories of one of York's greatest treasures, the Cliff Walk. I'm very fortunate to be able to say that I've been spending summers in York Harbor my whole life. Many summer vacations, particularly when I was a boy, were spent with my family at the home of my grandparents, which was situated on the Cliff Walk near Eastern Point. The house was known as Boxwood, a confusing name for a youngster until it was pointed out that boxwood is a lovely landscape bush with small shiny leaves found in English gardens and at the home of my grandparents, Mary and Dudley Stark. Perhaps the house still carries that name. Today it is owned by the Peterson family and sits, as one looks at it from the sea, between what I knew as the Richard homestead, called Millbury Meadow, the large white house that today is also owned by the Petersons, and what I knew as the home of Mrs. Balish. That house was called Peradventure. Today the property is owned by Mr. Rubin. My remarks are in the form of a travelogue, which, if nothing else, will display a bizarrely encyclopedic knowledge of every inch of the Cliff Walk, from the boardwalk at the old sea urchin bathhouse to the home of my grandparents and beyond. I'm delighted to share with you my memories. First, though, a word of explanation, so that I do not confuse you. Along the way, I'll depart from my travelogue to add information or provide impressions about other times, scenic departures, if you will. I'll try to be clear when I do that. So let us travel back in time to the early 1960s and to York Harbor as seen through the eyes of this young fellow. When I was about 12 years old, I had just finished a morning sailing lesson at the Agamenticus Yacht Club, or AYC. The AYC's clubhouse was a small one-room wooden structure, a storage shed, really, located right there, atop a dock near the back steps of the Marshall House, the stately brick hotel and Mariner's landmark. I had to get home for lunch, and wearing my brand new summer issue Keds sneakers, I sprinted off down the causeway, seen here, and here, over to the sea urchin, which you may remember right there, seen again right there, and on to the Cliff Walk, where I began the already well-known and much-loved half-mile journey to my grandparents' house. And here is my journey in a nutshell. Darting up the path from the sea urchin, between the goldenrod and the Queen's Anne lace, I swung myself around the railing where the walk takes a turn just before the reading room, right about there. And thankful to be out of sight of the grown-ups on the reading room deck, I slowed my pace as I rose to meet the fortress-like stone facade of Mr. and Mrs. Reed's house. Their home always reminded me of the illustrations in our copy of Treasure Island. To my right was a steep cliff with waves crashing below in what might have been Black Hill Cove, and to my left was the Reed's house, its architecture and the way it was perched, reminding me of the Admiral Benbow Inn pictured in the book. In my mind, on the other side of that stone facade sat Billy Bones with the blind beggar pausing in his plotting to size me up. Continuing my march upward, I reached the walk's first summit near a low wooden gate. Behind the gate was a flower garden near the front door of the Moorings, the big yellow house owned by Mrs. Mathis. Her flowers were so pretty that a rugged adventurer like me had to pause for a moment to admire them. Of course, I did not know then that gardening is a competitive sport, so I can only point to some innate sense of self-preservation as the reasons I never mentioned to my grandmother the spectacular garden of her friend Mrs. Mathis. With a glance over my right shoulder and a farewell to the harbor beach, I headed down and down again, making my way across a narrow and uneven section that bordered a sandy beach at the edge of the Mathis property. Right about there. Some years later, this beach would be the point of departure for a swimming expedition to the Black Rocks. It was the point of departure because the sandy beach was private property and therefore not subject to the purview of the harbor beach lifeguards. At least that was the reasoning behind the deal we struck with our friends, the lifeguards. That swimming expedition, which took place from here to here and back, was spectacular, a true National Geographic event. We might as well have been in the Galapagos. In addition to about 6 friends, a yellow rubber life raft, and lots of pairs of old sneakers for climbing on the rocks, the expedition included, of all people, my future father-in-law. He, too, had grown up spending summers in York Harbor, but had never been on the Black Rocks. So we let him come along, with a tacit respect for his youthful spirit and no small measure of pride in the fact that he had so obviously embraced one of our many goofy ideas. But that was all in the future. Returning to the cliff walk, I began the steep and winding climb to what must be the highest point of the walk, not far from the side door of what I knew as the house owned by the Raymonds, seen right there. And also here, in an early photo, a promontory with a view of the ocean looking south. Later, as an adult, I attended an exhibit of the works of Monet. One painting reminded me of this very spot. It was this one, called The Fisherman's House at Varangeville. Intrigued, I soon discovered another of his paintings. This one of another cliff walk in Normandy, called The Cliff Walk at Pourville. Put the two side by side, add a measure of artistic license, and one has a pretty close approximation of the Maine coast and the Atlantic from the highest point along the cliff walk, courtesy of Claude Monet. However, as a 12-year-old, I can assure you that I was not thinking about Claude Monet. It is far more likely that my thoughts would have turned to monkeys, flying ones, of the kind found in the army of the Wicked Witch of the West, whom I also half expected to encounter as I headed into the walk's one spooky section. Even on a sunny day, the way darkened as shafts of light pierced a dense canopy of bushes to reveal a mostly dirt path interrupted by shards of sharp rock. Here the steps were not round and smooth. Despite the descending grade, there were no steps at all, just a pass-at-your-own-risk section about 6 feet above a forbidding shore. But there's no place like home, and having survived that ordeal, I was getting closer, though it was impossible to know it, for I had entered no man's land, or so I called it. That label not only lacked originality, it was also inaccurate, as this part of the cliff walk was anything but forbidding. What made it special was the fact that when traversing its 50 or 60-yard length, one could see neither the harbor beach behind nor the homes of Eastern Point ahead. I usually made a point of stopping in no man's land to look out at the ocean in the direction of a mostly undeveloped Western Point and imagine the scene hundreds of years before with Indians, or perhaps a dory like this one just offshore. Have you ever been to the Grand Canyon? I went for the first time a few years ago, and I knew in an instant that it was the most spectacular panorama I had ever seen. Well, it may not have been the Grand Canyon, but as a small boy, when I took that one step, just that one small step around the corner from no man's land, what I saw had the same impact on me as the Grand Canyon. This view is a reasonable approximation of what I saw. Add to it high tide and a warm summer sun and dark blue waves crashing against a rocky coastline beneath manicured lawns, wildflowers, bushes in bloom, and tall trees gently waving in the breeze. In the midst of it all were 4 of the most majestic and beautifully situated seaside homes. And the best part was knowing that in one of those homes were my grandparents, who were always so happy to see me. Standing guard at the near end of the cove, close to where I stood, was the McIntyre house, called Seaward. The house was situated so close to the cliff, rose so steeply, and extended so far along it that it was effectively an extension of the cliff itself. Mrs. McIntyre lived there, and she was the grandmother of my friend Will Etheridge. Will and I are the same age. I have 2 younger brothers, and they are the same ages as Will's younger brothers. We never stopped to consider this happy coincidence in family planning because we were too busy exploring every inch of the cliff walk and rocky beach between our grandparents' homes. Here the cliff walk was as smart and well kept as the house. A series of gentle S-curves and granite outcroppings that had the distinguishing characteristic of being paved in cement and perfectly flat before rising to meet the comparatively small cottage of Alice and Henry Brooks, which would have been previously out of sight. What the Brooks' house lacked in size, it made up for in charm. Many will remember Henry Brooks, the nice man who lived there and in the house that replaced it for many years. Henry Brooks, like so many others of his generation, and like so many townspeople of York, served his country during World War II. In preparing this talk, I realized that the sons of the cliff walk, if you will, were well represented in terms of their wartime service. So much so that these young men, and they were very young, deserve special mention here. In July 1944, Jimmy Mathis, whose mother had the beautiful flower garden, was a Navy lieutenant serving aboard a PT boat in the English Channel. He did not survive the war. First Lieutenant Harry McIntyre, a fighter pilot, was a member of the 15th Air Force in Italy. Lieutenant Commander Van Richard was the skipper of a destroyer escort steaming in the Pacific on her way to Australia. Private Gregory Stark, my uncle, who graduated from high school in Chicago the year before, had just landed in France with Patton's Third Army. He did not survive the war. Lieutenant Dick Jackson, the brother of Mrs. Balish, was somewhere between Colorado and Italy, serving in the Army's 10th Mountain Division. I forget a lot of things, but one thing I never forget, especially on a beautiful summer day in Maine, are the sacrifices made by my uncle and his contemporaries to preserve the freedoms that we have today. From the rise in front of the Brooks' house, looking south along the cove's inner shore, Millbury Meadow, the Richards' house, was next, up ahead on the left, followed by Boxwood, the home of my grandparents, and then peradventure the home of Mrs. Balish. If Millbury Meadow was the grande dame of the three, and peradventure seen here, with her formidable watchtower-like presence, was the sentinel with a weather eye to the west, then Boxwood, the home of my grandparents, was the hidden gem. With her stone porches below and shingled ones above, some of them open and others enclosed, there was never any doubt about her Maine bones and her kinship with the sea. From where I stood, I could see my grandmother tending to her flowers on the porch, right about there. Before me lay the perfect home stretch for a kid with a new pair of Keds. A long straightaway that began with a slight downhill slope and even out into a grassy section before rising to a plateau at the border between the two properties. I took off. My pace soon reached and then surpassed that of a speeding bullet. As momentum propelled me up the gentle rise, I caught a glimpse of the green and white awning above Boxwood's stone porch. And then I looked down and I saw it, the snake, lying right where my Ked's shod foot was about to squish it. Mr. Snake looked up at me and I looked down at Mr. Snake. In that split second, time stood still. He darted to the right and I to the left. Careening around the corner, I ran up on the porch and gasping screamed, "A snake! I just saw a snake!" My grandmother turned and far too calmly said, "Pardon me, dear?" "It's a snake!" I grabbed her hand, pulled her off the porch, and led her to the scene of the drama where, courage restored, I began thrashing for that rattler or python or whatever it was. It was a 10-inch garter snake, never to be seen again. But the image of that snake, it was the first live, in-the-wild snake I had ever seen, is without doubt one of my most enduring childhood memories. Permit me to share a few more memories of the cliff walk. That particular day, the day William conquered the snake, was one when my journey along the cliff walk ended at my grandparents' house. But other days brought new adventures in different places. For example, on some occasions, I would head out onto the cliff walk, and instead of turning right in the direction of the harbor, I would turn left in the direction of the bell buoy. This meant traversing the cliff walk directly in front of my grandparents' house. Here, opposite a Rosa rugosa hedge on the seaward side of the path, was an iron railing. The railing posts were cemented into a seawall that was about 10 feet high and ran the entire length of the property, except in one place, and that was a very special place. Jutting out from the seawall, which to the casual observer is just another rock formation typical of the Maine coast. However, for me, it will ever be the foredeck, gun turret, and flag bridge of a battleship heaving and pounding into harm's way in a North Atlantic gale. Can you see it there? Here's another view from head on. And this was my view from the bridge. Having ridden out the gale and vanquished the enemies in that day's sea battle, I would have hopped back over the railing and proceeded on up the cliff walks 3 or 4 steps to take in yet another completely different vista from high above the shore at Mrs. Balish's house, seen here, let's hope, in an aerial view, where you have a very good view of the cliff walk. The view from Peradventure was one far out to sea, beyond the black rocks, and including the wide expanse of ocean between Boone Island and the Isles of Shoals. Nothing but the wide, wide ocean for thousands and thousands of miles. I imagined a foreign shore. And a few years later sat with my brother on that foreign shore. We were in England, at its southernmost tip, near the town of Falmouth in Cornwall. We looked to the west in the direction of Maine and stretched out on the grass and thought about York Harbor. And then I sat up, looked again, and realized that what we were looking at was almost precisely the same view as that from the cliff walk at Mrs. Balish's house, a perfect mirror image, one measuring 3,000 miles across. For those of you who know the cliff walk well, I think you'll agree. But that's not Western Point, with Kittery and Portsmouth off in the distance. Rather, it's Pendennis Point in Cornwall. Meanwhile, returning to the cliff walk of my youth, it was here, near Peradventure, that my journey usually ended. I might have probed the thicket beyond Mrs. Balish's or ventured out onto the rocks near there, but frankly, it became a little boring as the walk dissipated. With clarity of thought seldom seen in adulthood, I thought, well, there's no cliff here, so I guess there's no cliff walk, and headed home. Little did I know then of the cliff walk's rich history and lengthy expanse. But I know what you're thinking. What's all this about the Strategic Air Command? Let's turn to that topic. As I think has been demonstrated, in my travels along the cliff walk, I noticed everything. In fact, I am going to do you a real favor and spare you an account of every semi-submerged rock that lies inside the black rocks from the harbor beach to the eastern point Nunbuoy. But another thing I noticed, it was difficult not to notice them, were the airplanes. Huge ones that flew right overhead and were low enough for me to see their U.S. Air Force markings. The planes became a source of intense interest and led to conversations with my father and grandfather and an education in Pease Air Force Base, the Soviet threat, and the specifications of the B-47 and B-52 bombers. The B-47 Stratojet and the B-52 Stratofortress flew daily deterrent patrols up and down the East Coast during the years when Pease was a Strategic Air Command base. For a kid, this stuff was too good to be true. Figuring I could be of service as a coast watcher, I studied up on Russian aircraft and Russian submarines. And if the commies were planning on storming the beach, I'd be ready for them. And they'd be in big trouble. You know why? 2 reasons. First, our babysitter at the time was the lovely Cynthia Bannister, now Cynthia Hosmer and still lovely. She was Admiral Bannister's daughter, which of course meant that I had a direct line to the Pentagon, if not to the president himself. And second, they'd have to contend with this fearsome action hero. Oh, dear. That's too bad. That was me on the York Harbor beach at age 12. We'll retrieve that. And so such are my memories of life on the cliff walk and of a pretty special childhood. Also special to me are my memories of my grandparents, who made it all possible. Permit me to close with a few comments about my grandparents, Mary and Dudley Stark. This blurry photograph of my grandmother and me is one of my favorites. But don't let her sweet smile fool you. She lived to 102 and had the constitution of a Navy SEAL and a stubborn streak as wide as the seven seas. Sometimes she and I would discuss, or rather debate, the topic of the cliff walk. She had mixed feelings about it, and matters were further complicated when, after my grandfather died, she moved her bedroom downstairs and had to contend with cliff walkers traipsing up her yard and by her bedroom window in order to access Millbury Lane. One time a group knocked on her door and asked if they could use her bathroom. That idea did not go over very well. Another time, my grandmother learned that I had trimmed her Rosa rugosa hedge in order to make it easier for people to navigate the cliff walk. That idea didn't go over very well either. When she learned what I had done, she was, quote, quite provoked, end quote, which in her parlance meant she was somewhere beyond upset. And if she knew I were here giving this talk, she would be quite provoked. In fact, for about 20 minutes, I've, in all seriousness, been waiting for the thunderbolt to strike. This is my grandfather, Dudley Stark, who was described as a brilliant theologian. I would describe him as a quiet leader who commanded immense respect. One would not have placed him in the vanguard of the civil rights movement, but that is exactly where he was. I regret that I had so few grown-up conversations with him. But what I did learn from him was the importance of being an independent thinker. To the extent that we did talk seriously, it was during the 2 or 3 years before he died. I had just obtained my driver's license. While they owned a car, neither grandparent knew how to drive. Thus, I would chauffeur them around town, driving Miss Daisy style in their black Buick Electra. Sometimes my grandfather would join me in the front seat and we would do errands together. This meant touring the countryside, something he loved to do. We would drive to York Beach for fish and fruit, to Kittery for vegetables, and to Portsmouth for meat. Returning to York, we would stop at Nat Marshall's hardware store in the village, and then Dr. Hawk's pharmacy and the post office in the harbor. It was my grandfather who introduced me to York history in all its forms. In particular, he made me much more aware of the town's year-round residents, people for whom he had a special fondness and immense respect. People named Apgar, Avery, Bardwell, Berger, Bridges, Cody, Donnell, Foster, McCarthy, Raines, and Vinal, to name but a few. Through him and through them, I came to more fully appreciate what a truly special place this is. How I wish Skinny Vinal could come back to life marching up and down his dock, the undisputed king, Neptune of his realm. How I would love one more chat with Willis Bardwell, like the one when he told me his school bus was a horse-drawn hay wagon. How I wish I could simply drive around town doing errands with my grandfather. Those things can't happen, but other things can. And reversing what has happened to the cliff walk is one of them. The cliff walk is York history. It is York history just as much as the old jail and Nubble Light. When it comes to the cliff walk, I really do hope we can turn back the hands of time. And that is why I hope every citizen of York will join with me in giving wholehearted support to the Friends of the Cliff Walk and the good work of this important organization. So I thank you very much for your time.